The soft glow of evening sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, painting the room in warm shades of gold and amber. Dust motes drifted lazily through the light, floating like tiny stars suspended in the air. Resting peacefully beneath the covers, eyes closed and breathing calm, he drifted deeper into a dream that unfolded with remarkable clarity. In that dream, morning arrived gently. Sunlight filtered through pale curtains, spreading across the room in delicate ribbons of light. She stirred beneath her blankets, slowly opening her eyes to a space that felt comforting and familiar in every possible way. The room was peaceful, filled with the quiet stillness that exists only before the world fully wakes. For a few moments she remained tucked beneath the covers, enjoying the calm. Her nightdress, made of soft cotton decorated with a subtle floral pattern, shifted comfortably as she stretched. The fabric brushed lightly against her skin, and she smiled to herself. Everything felt effortless, natural, and perfectly ordinary. The alarm had not sounded yet. There was no rush. She allowed herself to enjoy those precious minutes of tranquility, listening to the faint sounds of the house around her. The distant chirping of birds drifted through the open window, accompanied by the occasional rustle of leaves outside. It was the kind of morning that seemed to promise something wonderful. Eventually, she pushed herself upright and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her hair tumbled across her shoulders, slightly tangled from sleep. A few loose strands fell across her face as she stood and crossed the room. Her school uniform had already been prepared the night before and hung neatly from a hook on the back of the bedroom door. The white blouse looked freshly pressed and spotless. Beside it hung a black cardigan, folded carefully, and a neatly pleated skirt that would sway gently with every step she took. Everything was organized exactly as she liked it. On top of her dresser sat the rest of what she needed for the day. Her tie, decorated with red and silver stripes, pair of opaque black tights, hairbrush, and a deep blue scrunchie she had specifically chosen because it matched the rest of her outfit perfectly. Before getting dressed, however, she headed toward the bathroom. The cool floor beneath her feet felt refreshing as she walked. Inside, the mirror greeted her with a reflection that felt entirely familiar. She smiled softly before beginning her morning routine. Cold water splashed against her face, helping the last traces of sleep fade away. She brushed her teeth carefully, humming quietly to herself as she moved through the familiar routine. A small amount of lip balm completed the process, not because anyone would particularly notice, but because it helped her feel prepared and confident for the day ahead. There was comfort in these little rituals. The simple acts that transformed a sleepy morning into the start of a new day. Returning to her bedroom, she began getting dressed. She selected her favorite undergarments from the drawer and laid everything out carefully on the bed. Then she sat on the edge of the mattress and gathered one leg of her tights. Pulling them on required patience. She carefully smoothed the fabric upward, making sure no wrinkles remained. The tights were practical, warm, and comfortable. Once they were in place, she stood and checked that they sat correctly. Satisfied, she reached for her blouse. One button after another, she fastened it neatly, adjusting the collar and smoothing the material until it looked perfect. The skirt followed, secured comfortably at the waist and adjusted until it rested exactly where she wanted it. Then came the cardigan. The soft knit fabric settled comfortably around her shoulders, providing warmth against the cool morning air. Finally, she picked up her tie. The knot took 2 attempts. She laughed quietly when the first effort ended up slightly crooked. Starting over, she carefully looped and tightened the fabric until it rested neatly beneath her collar. There was a strange satisfaction in getting it exactly right. The polished black shoes waiting by the bed completed the uniform. When she finally stood before the full-length mirror, she paused. For several seconds she simply looked at her reflection. The uniform looked smart and tidy. Everything matched perfectly. The overall effect was exactly what she had hoped for. A genuine smile spread across her face. Not one practiced for photographs. Not one forced out of politeness. A real smile born from simple happiness. The only thing left was her hair. Picking up the brush, she carefully worked through the remaining tangles. Once satisfied, she gathered her hair into a high ponytail. The familiar tension felt reassuring as she secured it with the blue scrunchie. The ponytail bounced lightly when she turned her head. Perfect. Her school bag already waited beside the door. She knelt beside it and performed her usual final inspection. Notebooks. Pencil case. English novel. Planner filled with colorful notes and tiny doodles. Everything was exactly where it should be. Satisfied, she slipped her phone into her cardigan pocket and lifted the bag onto her shoulder. Before leaving, she took one last glance around her room. Morning sunlight now filled every corner. The day felt full of possibility. Heading downstairs, she called a cheerful goodbye toward the rest of the household and stepped outside. Fresh air greeted her immediately. The morning carried just enough chill to make the cardigan feel welcome. As she adjusted her bag strap and started down the path, her ponytail swayed gently behind her. The neighborhood was already awake. Leaves rustled softly in the breeze. Birdsong echoed from nearby trees. Cars moved steadily along distant roads. Everything felt pleasantly familiar. A short distance away, she spotted several friends walking together. They were laughing about something, their conversation carrying across the quiet street. "Wait for me," she called. One of them turned and waved enthusiastically. "There she is. We thought you'd oversleep." She laughed as she caught up. Not a chance. The group welcomed her naturally, making room as she slipped into step beside them. Conversation immediately resumed. Homework complaints, weekend plans, teachers they liked, teachers they definitely did not like. The topics shifted constantly, each one blending seamlessly into the next. At one point, one of her friends linked arms with hers. The casual gesture filled her with warmth, the kind of simple happiness that comes from feeling included. Together they continued toward school, talking and laughing the entire way. Eventually the school building appeared ahead. Tall gates stood open, welcoming students arriving from every direction. The familiar sight usually felt ordinary. Today it felt special. Not because anything extraordinary was happening, but because she belonged there. She belonged with the people beside her. As they entered through the gates together, she felt surrounded by a quiet sense of comfort and certainty. The day was only beginning. Inside the school, the hallways buzzed with activity. Lockers slammed shut. Students called greetings to one another. Groups gathered in small circles, exchanging stories before classes began. The atmosphere felt energetic but familiar. She moved through the crowd with her friends, navigating the busy corridors effortlessly. One of them groaned dramatically. "I still can't believe we're expected to remember all those French verbs." She laughed. "I made flashcards." Immediately, several friends looked interested. "You did? Can you help me revise before class?" "Absolutely." Setting her bag down beside a locker, she pulled out the neatly organized cards. Within moments they were reviewing vocabulary together. Correct answers earned cheers. Incorrect ones earned playful groans. The entire exercise quickly became more entertaining than stressful. Nearby, another friend brought up a television series they had both been watching. "Did you see the ending?" Her eyes widened. "I nearly screamed." "Same." The discussion became animated almost instantly. Theories were exchanged. Favorite scenes were debated. Promises were made to continue the conversation during lunch. Eventually, the warning bell echoed throughout the building. Students began moving with greater urgency. Books were collected. Bags were adjusted. Final conversations were hurriedly finished. "See you later. At lunch. Don't forget the flashcards." They parted ways, heading toward different classrooms. She made her way upstairs. Students streamed around her in both directions, creating a steady flow of movement throughout the stairwells and corridors. When she reached her classroom, she arrived just before the final bell. Perfect timing. The room was already filling. Her seat sat near the window, where sunlight poured across the desks. Several classmates were already there, chatting happily while comparing nail polish colors and discussing plans for the weekend. She slid into her chair, unpacked her books, and glanced out the window. The day stretched ahead of her. Lessons, friends, laughter, small challenges, ordinary moments. And somehow, in this dream, every one of those ordinary moments felt absolutely perfect. "Morning," she said cheerfully as she arrived at her desk, setting down her books and slipping her bag beneath the table. Before she could even sit properly, one of the girls beside her noticed her hair accessory. "Oh wow, that scrunchie is adorable." She instinctively reached up to touch it. "This one?" "Yes. The color suits you perfectly." A second girl nodded in agreement. "It ties the whole outfit together." A warm feeling settled inside her chest. It wasn't a dramatic compliment, just one of those casual observations friends made without thinking. Somehow those always felt the most genuine. "Thanks," she replied, smiling. "I spent way too long deciding whether it matched." "It definitely does." The teacher stood at the front of the room with the register open, calling names one after another while conversations gradually faded. As each student answered, the room settled into a comfortable quiet. When her turn came, she responded immediately. "Present, Mississippi." The name sounded familiar and comfortable. Hearing it spoken aloud felt natural, as though it belonged exactly where it was. The register was completed, followed by the usual morning announcements. A charity event planned for later in the week. A reminder about after-school clubs. An invitation for students interested in joining the debate team. Most people listened with only half their attention while organizing books and chatting quietly. With a few spare minutes before the lesson officially began, one of the girls at her table pulled a small mirror from her bag. A tube of lip gloss followed shortly after. "Can I borrow that later?" she asked. "Of course." The girl held it up. "It's the strawberry one." Immediately another friend laughed. "The one that smells like actual candy." "Exactly." The gloss quickly made its way around the table. Each girl applied a small amount while continuing their conversation. When it reached her, she added only a subtle touch before handing it back. The sweet scent lingered pleasantly. The gesture itself felt ordinary and comfortable, one of those tiny social rituals that somehow strengthened friendships without anyone noticing. Soon afterward, everyone gathered their belongings and headed toward English. The hallways bustled with students moving between classrooms. Groups merged and separated depending on schedules, creating constantly shifting clusters of friends. She ended up walking with two girls she had known for years. The conversation had already started before they reached the classroom. "I'm telling you," one girl insisted, "the main character is completely responsible for everything that happened." "No way." "He absolutely is. He didn't know what the consequences would be." "That's not an excuse." Their debate continued all the way to the door. The English classroom greeted them with familiar smells. Old books, dry markers, paper. Sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating floating particles of dust that drifted lazily through the air. Everything felt calm. She took her usual seat and pulled out her well-used copy of the novel. Its pages were bent and covered in notes scribbled in the margins. Several passages had been highlighted. Small sticky tabs protruded from the edges. Across from her, one friend immediately reopened the debate. "But that's exactly why it's frustrating." "I think that's the point," she replied. Both girls looked at her. She shrugged. "People don't always realize they're making mistakes until it's too late." A thoughtful silence followed. Then one of them nodded. "Actually, that's true." Their teacher arrived moments later, and the discussion shifted into the lesson itself. The class explored symbolism, character motivations, and recurring themes throughout the text. Several times she found herself contributing to the discussion. Ideas came easily. When she raised her hand, her teacher listened attentively. One observation earned an approving nod. "Excellent interpretation." The simple praise brought a quiet sense of satisfaction. Not because she wanted attention, because it felt good to know her thoughts mattered. During independent work time, the room settled into concentrated silence. Pens scratched steadily across paper. Pages turned. Occasional whispers drifted between desks. She focused on her notebook, writing carefully. Nearby, one friend decorated her notes with tiny sketches of flowers and stars. Another stared thoughtfully at the whiteboard while absent-mindedly chewing the cap of her pen. Eventually that friend leaned closer. "What did you write for question 3? Without hesitation, she angled her notebook slightly. The two compared answers quietly. Their heads bent together over the page. The teacher noticed but didn't object. Collaborative thinking was encouraged as long as everyone remained focused. By the time the lesson ended, several pages of work had been completed. Homework instructions were given. Books were packed away. Chairs scraped against the floor as students stood. The transition from lesson to freedom felt almost instantaneous. Morning break arrived like a collective exhale. Students flooded into corridors. Friends reunited. Conversations resumed. Her group naturally drifted toward their usual location near the library. A bench sat there beneath a large window where sunlight always seemed to fall perfectly. It had unofficially become their spot. Some sat on the bench itself. Others sat cross-legged on the floor. A friend produced a packet of biscuits from her bag. "I brought extras." Instant popularity. The biscuits quickly circulated around the group. She accepted one gratefully, realizing she was far hungrier than she had expected. The conversation jumped randomly between topics. Television shows, homework, weekend plans, funny things younger siblings had done. At one point somebody suddenly froze. "Oh no!" Everyone looked over. "What?" "I completely forgot about the science quiz." The reaction was immediate. Collective groans echoed around the circle. Another friend sighed dramatically. "My mom practically forced me to revise." "What is it even on?" "Photosynthesis, I think." "And respiration." Uncertain faces turned toward her. She pulled out her phone. "I wrote notes last night." Within seconds everyone crowded around. She scrolled through neatly organized summaries. Photosynthesis, cellular respiration, enzymes. The group immediately began a frantic final revision session. Definitions were reviewed. Processes were repeated aloud. Someone attempted to invent a memory trick. Didn't work. Everyone laughed anyway. While they revised, one girl absent-mindedly braided another's hair. Someone else sat texting, smiling mysteriously at her screen. The atmosphere felt relaxed despite the approaching quiz. When the bell finally rang, a chorus of disappointment followed. Break always seemed shorter than it actually was. The group dispersed once again. Different schedules pulled everyone toward different classrooms. Her next lesson was history. The room always seemed a few degrees warmer than the rest of the school. Nobody knew why. The class settled into their usual seats while the teacher prepared a presentation. Today's topic focused on wartime propaganda. Images appeared on the projector. Recruitment posters. Patriotic slogans. Carefully designed messages intended to influence public opinion. The teacher paused on one particular image. "What emotions do you think this poster is trying to create?" She studied it carefully. A family occupied the foreground. A soldier stood in the distance. The composition felt deliberate. "Maybe guilt," she suggested. Several classmates turned toward her. She continued. "Like it's implying that if someone doesn't help, they're letting down the people they care about." Teacher smiled. "Exactly." The discussion expanded from there. Students analyzed color choices, wording, symbolism, and intended audiences. Later, the class was divided into groups and challenged to design propaganda posters for completely fictional causes. Her group immediately chose something ridiculous. The library revolution. The goal: encouraging students to read more books. The assignment quickly transformed into chaos. Dramatic slogans appeared. Exaggerated drawings covered the page. Someone illustrated a heroic student triumphantly holding a novel above their head. Another designed a giant stack of books towering over the city skyline. By presentation time, everyone was struggling not to laugh. The class responded exactly as they hoped. Laughter, applause, good-natured teasing. The activity left everyone smiling. By the end of the lesson, however, one thing had become impossible to ignore. She was hungry, very hungry. Lunch arrived at exactly the right moment. The cafeteria greeted students with its usual organized chaos. Trays clattered. Conversations overlapped. The scent of dozens of different meals filled the air. Every table seemed occupied. After collecting lunch, she carefully navigated through the crowd. A jacket potato topped with cheese and beans sat on her tray alongside a bottle of water and an apple. Her friends had already secured their usual table. Bags were piled underneath. Coats draped across chairs. The group squeezed together comfortably. As soon as she sat down, someone pointed excitedly. "Now we can finally talk about the episode." Instant chaos. Hands shot up. Spoiler warnings were issued. Those who hadn't watched it dramatically covered their ears. The rest launched into enthusiastic discussion. Theories, predictions, favorite scenes, shocking moments. Everyone seemed determined to speak at once. She listened, laughed, contributed her own thoughts, and slowly enjoyed her lunch. At one point a friend pointed toward her tray. "That actually looks good. Want a bite?" A forkful was accepted. Another friend showed everyone a short video on her phone. Within seconds, the entire table dissolved into laughter. One girl pointed at her. "Your laugh makes everyone else laugh." She immediately felt her cheeks warm. "No, it doesn't. It absolutely does. You're one to talk." The friend looked offended. "What does that mean?" "You do that little snort." "I do not." "You definitely do." The table erupted again. The laughter spread from person to person until several were wiping tears from their eyes. Lunch passed far too quickly. Conversations shifted toward weekend plans. Birthday celebrations. Potential cinema trips. New restaurants people wanted to try. Ideas formed. Plans developed. Promises were made. Eventually the bell rang. Groans followed. Nobody wanted to leave. Still, trays were cleared and bags collected. The afternoon waited. The energy of the day had changed now. Morning excitement had softened into something gentler. Sunlight entered classrooms at lower angles. Everything seemed touched by gold. A pleasant tiredness settled over the school. Adjusting her slightly loosened ponytail, she gathered her books and headed toward her next lesson. Art, always a favorite. The art room sat at the far end of a quieter corridor. Even before stepping inside, she could smell familiar scents drifting through the doorway. Paint, paper, clay, creativity. The room always felt different from every other classroom. Less structured, more open. Place where imagination seemed welcome. As she crossed the threshold, she felt a small smile appear. The afternoon still held plenty of moments waiting to happen. The art room always felt different from every other classroom in the building. The moment she stepped through the doorway, the atmosphere changed. Instead of rows of desks and whiteboards, the room was filled with creativity in progress. Large tables were scattered throughout the space, each covered with sketches, paints, unfinished sculptures, and colorful supplies. The walls displayed student artwork in every stage of development, from rough concepts pinned to corkboards to nearly completed masterpieces waiting for final touches. There was something comforting about it. Nothing in the room needed to be perfect yet. Everything was still becoming. She made her way to her usual table and carefully unpacked her materials. Around her, several other girls were already settling in, opening portfolios and arranging supplies. Their current projects centered around themes of identity, memory, and personal expression. For her piece, she had chosen a combination of different materials: paint, magazine cutouts, pieces of handwritten text, pressed flowers she had preserved between the pages of an old novel. She spread everything out carefully and examined her work. The project was progressing well, but she still wasn't entirely satisfied with the arrangement. A girl sitting beside her leaned closer to get a better look. "I really like the color palette you're using." She glanced up. The blues and silvers work beautifully together. A smile appeared immediately. "Thank you." The compliment encouraged her. "I'm still trying to figure out the layout though." She pointed toward one section. "Does this side feel crowded to you?" Both girls tilted their heads while studying it. After a moment, her friend nodded thoughtfully. "A little. I knew it. But I don't think you need to remove anything." "What would you do?" The girl reached forward and pointed toward an empty area. "Maybe add something small here. Just enough to balance the composition." Her eyes widened. "That's it." Immediately she could see it. The missing piece. The visual weight suddenly made sense. "I think you're right." Their teacher gradually moved from table to table, offering suggestions and encouragement to students as they worked. Eventually she arrived at their group. She paused for a moment, studying the artwork spread across the table. Then her attention settled on the piece in front of her. "This is wonderful progress." The praise instantly caught her attention. The teacher pointed toward one section. "I especially like how you're layering textures to communicate feeling." She nodded. "That wasn't entirely intentional at first. Those are often the strongest artistic decisions." The teacher smiled warmly. "Trust that instinct." With that, she moved on to the next group. The encouragement lingered long afterward. She returned to her work feeling more confident than before. Around her, the room settled into a peaceful rhythm. Someone asked to borrow paint. Another student quietly sang along to music playing through one earbud. Pencils moved across paper. Brushes glided over canvas. Scissors cut through magazines. The sounds blended together into a gentle creative soundtrack. Time always seemed to move differently during art. Minutes disappeared without warning. She became absorbed in small decisions. Where should this flower be placed? Would another layer of paint improve the background? Did the composition feel balanced now? One choice led naturally to another. Slowly, the project became something that felt increasingly personal. Something that belonged entirely to her. When the bell finally rang, she nearly jumped. Surely the lesson couldn't be over already. Yet students all around the room were beginning to clean up. Paintbrushes were rinsed. Tables were wiped down. Materials were carefully packed away. Her hands bore faint traces of paint despite her efforts. Blue along one finger. Silver across her palm. She smiled at the sight. There was something satisfying about carrying visible evidence that she had spent an hour creating something. As she packed her portfolio away, several girls waved goodbye. "See you tomorrow. Don't forget to bring that reference photo." "I won't." She returned the smiles before gathering the last of her materials. Next came mathematics. Not her strongest subject. Not her favorite either. Yet there was something rewarding about it in a completely different way. Unlike art, where possibilities seemed endless, maths offered certainty. There was an answer. Solution. A process that could be followed. She took her usual seat beside two friends who understood the subject far better than she did. Fortunately, neither of them ever made her feel embarrassed when she struggled. Whenever she got stuck, they simply explained things again. Patiently, clearly, without judgment. The lesson focused on algebra and more advanced equations. Numbers filled the board. Symbols spread across pages. First, the work seemed confusing. Then one of her friends leaned over. "Look at this part first." She pointed at a step in the equation. "You need to rearrange it before anything else." The explanation clicked instantly. "Oh!" Understanding spread across her face. "I see it now." Her friend grinned. "There you go." The small victory felt surprisingly satisfying. Throughout the lesson they worked through problems together. Checking calculations. Comparing answers. Helping each other when mistakes appeared. At the front of the room, the teacher introduced a new concept: quadratic equations. The explanation filled several sections of the board. She copied everything carefully, determined to understand it properly, even when it felt challenging, even when she had to reread sections twice. A folded piece of paper suddenly appeared on her desk. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a quick sketch. Cat. An absurdly long cat. The creature wore a graduation cap and looked unusually proud of itself. She immediately covered her mouth to stop herself from laughing. Looking across the table, she saw her friend trying very hard not to smile. Without hesitation, she flipped the paper over. A few quick lines later, the cat now held a diploma. The certificate read, "Official Very Long Scholar." The note returned across the table. Her friend's shoulders shook with silent laughter. Moments later, they both returned to their work as though nothing had happened. The final lesson of the day was geography. By now, the afternoon sunlight had become rich and golden, the kind of light that seemed to make everything look nostalgic. The classroom glowed softly. Students looked slightly more tired. The end of the day was approaching. Today's topic focused on ecosystems and environmental change. Large maps appeared on the projector. Photographs, satellite images. The lesson explored the effects of human activity on natural environments around the world. Despite her growing tiredness, she found herself genuinely interested. One image in particular captured the class's attention. A comparison showing widespread deforestation over several decades. The difference was striking. The discussion that followed became thoughtful and surprisingly serious. Students debated responsibility, conservation, economic pressures, long-term consequences. She contributed several observations of her own. Others expanded upon them. The conversation felt meaningful, not simply answering questions for grades, but discussing issues that genuinely mattered, issues that would shape the future. For the final section of the lesson, students worked in project groups. Her group had been assigned coral reef ecosystems. Laptops opened, textbooks appeared, research documents were shared. Everyone quickly divided responsibilities. One student volunteered to gather statistics. Another focused on environmental threats. A third began organizing presentation slides. Then someone looked toward her. "Would you mind handling the section about symbiotic relationships?" She blinked. "Me? You're really good at explaining things." Several others nodded in agreement. The compliment caught her off guard. "Sure," she smiled. "I can do that." Soon they were exchanging contact information and organizing a group chat to continue working outside school. By the time everything was arranged, they had a clear plan and a surprisingly organized schedule. Then came the final bell. The best bell. The one everyone waited for. Its sound echoed through the building and was immediately followed by movement everywhere. Chairs scraped against floors. Books disappeared into bags. Conversations resumed. The entire school seemed to breathe out at once. The day was officially over. She packed her belongings and stood. Her cardigan had become slightly creased throughout the day, and she smoothed it absent-mindedly. A loose strand of hair had escaped from her ponytail. She tucked it behind her ear. Then she joined the steady stream of students moving toward the exits. Everyone seemed lighter now, freer. The pressure of lessons temporarily lifted. Near the main entrance she spotted several friends waiting. As usual, their after-school walking group assembled naturally. Someone noticed her immediately. "There she is. Ready to escape." She laughed. "Absolutely." Together they stepped outside. The afternoon air felt fresh against her skin. Cooler than before. Comfortably crisp. The cardigan was exactly enough. Above them stretched a bright sky painted with thin streaks of cloud. Everything seemed touched by warm autumn sunlight. The kind of light photographers chase. Beautiful precisely because it never lasts. The group began their journey home. Sometimes they walked side by side. Sometimes the pavement forced them into pairs. The conversation flowed effortlessly. Stories from the day, funny classroom moments, homework complaints, random observations. One friend suddenly laughed. Did anyone else see Mark in history? Several people immediately knew what was coming. He was asleep. Completely asleep. His head was literally on the desk. The group burst into laughter. Then someone remembered. His little brother's been ill though. Oh! The laughter softened. That's fair. I'd probably fall asleep too. A short while later they reached the corner shop. Nobody suggested stopping. They simply did. It had become part of the routine.